Well, welcome to the third of this series of revisiting Whitley Lectures from the past. And we're still in the kind of deep, dark past of the 1990s as we come to this third lecture, which is called A Shared Meal and a Common Table, Some Reflections on the Lord's Supper and Baptists by Keith Jones. And for the first time in this series, we have Keith with us as the author of that lecture. Who's going to help reflect, I guess, on what he was trying to do in that lecture and what he might want to say perhaps today if he was giving it again. But just as we start, I think it's been really interesting how these first three lectures, and actually the fourth one, were touching on subjects which perhaps Baptists hadn't thought about very much. So in one sense, politics with Nigel Wright, women and ministry with Ruth Goldman, the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, depending on what name we give it, and Keith explores that in his lecture. And the next one, which we'll look at in this series, was on children. And while there was a book called Baptism in the New Testament by George Beasley Murray, we never had the equivalent on the Lord's Supper. And so I think it was really timely that in this early relaunch of this series, Keith addresses this topic to get us thinking. And it's a topic that perhaps we continue need to think about and reflect upon in terms of what we think is going on when we gather around the table. So Keith, over to you to kind of share perhaps what you thought you were trying to do with the lecture and perhaps revisiting it yourself 20 years on.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy. It's good to be with you. Of course, I'm not in the category of theologian. I'm a church historian, so there are inadequacies in my reflection on all these things. My 1999 lecture is, I dare to suggest, the only one in the series that's ever been published in two languages, certainly in Czech. And it wasn't my idea, it was the idea of the then trustees that there should be a Czech version of this, which my colleague, Doctor of Jurisprudence, Petra Vesela, had to labor over. Some of the words I used were not in her then current Czech vocabulary, so it was a bit of an issue for Petra, but she did it. During the 1970s and the first part of the 1980s, I'd felt a profound sense that the Lord's Supper I had grown up with was inadequate and not true to the meal as it had emerged in the early church, nor in the insights of Zwingli and the Anabaptist theologian Hubmaier, and in many ways had been subject to a reductionism which was not in accord with its true roots. At the beginning of the lecture, I described the pattern and form of service that I had experienced as a teenager in my home church. And as I got to the point of becoming a local preacher, I certainly discovered it was exactly the same form in the neighbouring Baptist churches in Bradford and the West Riding. So it may be a provincial issue. There may have been enlightened folk in the deep south or the far west or wherever, but certainly Yorkshire Baptists operated very much as my description of the Tetley Street Memorial Baptist Church. The attempt to promote a better liturgical form and experience had been provided by Ernie Payne and Stephen Winward in their little book, Orders and Prayers for Church Worship. And I don't think many people ever read the introductory essay. I did. I was that sort of nerd at the time, and I got this as a young local preacher because they said, oh, some useful prayers in it. But I actually read the thing and realised that Payne and Winward were trying to do something else than simply people taking hold of the prayers. At university, I was confronted with the Anglican liturgist Dom Gregory Dix and The Shape of the Liturgy. And here he has that marvellous passage where he refers to the real presence, supposedly, and the fact that in our churches, it was more the real absence of Christ. That was reinforced for me when three of us students were allowed to go to Taizé in the south of France to one of the preparatory meetings for the Worldwide Council of Youth. And we met there one of the Scottish Episcopalian brothers who was amused by these three Baptist students and said, "Oh, of course, you're the people who believe in the real absence of Christ at the Eucharist." And I think that stung me at the time. And I thought, I don't know that that's quite right. At the Northeastern Baptist Ministers' Conference at Cober Hill in the late 1970s, my interest in all of this was spurred because we had Michael Walker come to speak to us. And he delivered a series of fascinating lectures to me about the liturgy and how he conducted the services in Holy Week at Beckenham Baptist Church. And there I learned about the renewal of baptismal vows on late Saturday night and lighting the new fire in the church car park and all these exotic things. But at the heart of it, Michael was sharing with us that there was a lot we could recover as Baptists in terms of the shape and value and indeed the theology of the Eucharist. He really sparked in me a passionate understanding of worship as drama, which knocked into another ballpark the lackluster services of my youth. In 1984, I enjoyed a sabbatical at the Baptist Theological Seminary in Rüschlikon, Switzerland, where I was fortunate enough to develop what has become a lifelong friendship with Wayne Pipkin, a scholar who had made a study of Zwingli and the early Anabaptists the heart of his thinking. And the year I went, 1984, was the 500th anniversary of the death of Zwingli. And he delivered a lecture at a conference in Manchester, in Canada, sorry, which I found fascinating because there he explored and repudiated the attack of Dom Gregory Dix about Zwinglian Eucharistic theology. Much, I think, in the end, to the annoyance of the Council of the Yorkshire Baptist Association, I got permission from Wayne to print and publish the lecture, Zwingli, the positive value of his Eucharistic writings, by the Yorkshire Baptist Association. They've never done anything like that before. They've never done anything like it again. The majority of the copies of this document were pulped in due course by my successor. But that's life, isn't it? You know, if you've not had something pulped by somebody, you've not really lived. But there, Pipkin explores actually all of Zwingli's writings and does present a counter-argument to Dom Gregory Dix, a theology of the Eucharist which was actually much deeper and profound than the common comment about Zwinglianism. He gave it a name. I don't think anybody else up to that point had given it a name. And he called it transsignification. So that became my watchword over the years. This Whitley lecture is of its time. I have a go, and in fact, part of the lecture ended up as a piece in the Baptist Times, the bit about the Dolly's teacups, which got me into tremendous trouble all across the denomination. I also at one point quoted the Zwinglian scholar Locher, who was at the University of Zurich, who said, you know, some other traditions were like going to the post office to buy a stamp at the counter, because the positive things about Zwingli was he'd torn out all the inside of the Grossmünster in Zurich and placed tables down the middle to get people sat down as if participating in a real meal together. You know, the more you read about what he actually did, the more you find Dom Gregory Dix a bit of an annoyance. So I was having a go at all my pet thoughts about where British Baptists were. Almost universally now, we've got rid of the small chunks of sliced bread experienced the common loaf broken open. Uh, we've not quite adopted the views of our Eastern European friends who remain appalled that British Baptists still have the Dolly's teacup with non-alcoholic drink in them. There's nothing like going to a Russian Baptist service and the big flagons being passed around with high quality Georgian wine in them, to that sense that here we'll experience the true blood of Christ. So what would I say? I think many things have progressed. What Payne and Winwood only briefly refer to is the possible influence of other traditions. And they know what we had yet, when they published their book, to discover was insights from Pentecostal sort of experience. And I think today that will be the case. The marrying, which is possible for many Baptists, of the insights of the liturgical movement, which Payne and Winwood are anxious about, and the joy and splendor of Pentecostal worship. I well remember one of the first churches in Yorkshire, of Baptist churches, to experience a main charismatic renewal, the church at Wheatley Park, Doncaster. And they found so much going on. And the then minister said to me, Keith, we've had to work out how to provide some structure for the joy and exuberance when we celebrate the meal. And he'd found that answer in what was then the Anglican Church Series 3 Eucharistic Order. So there was Wheatley Park, Doncaster, where you never knew what was going to happen when you went to worship there, but it was somehow structured. They had married the enthusiasm of thanksgiving, the Eucharist, with the insights of the church's experience through Series 3. What am I trying to say? My experience as a teenager was of something that spoke so much about the death of Christ, you thought you were simply gathering to remember a martyr. The journey to experience more of the joy of the Eucharistic thanksgiving when meeting to meet with the risen Saviour. The value of a true understanding of Zwingli, that he's not to be reduced, as Don Gregory Dix argued, but understood. Actually, my own attitude has moved beyond Zwingli to Hubmaier, who saw the real presence of Christ in the people, in the Eucharistic theology he designed at Mikolov in Moravia. So what are my reflections? The charismatic movement did much to help us out of the world of sad memorial into the world of following a resurrected Saviour. We do not now experience the divided service of those who are in and out. You know, the folk in my teenage years having to move to the side of the church or go out of the door whilst the deacons disappeared off into the vestry, then reappeared and to uncover the table. Though not everyone appreciated the work of the joint liturgical group and the Baptist members of it, 25 years on, I see their insights being appropriated in many of our churches. Interestingly, I note from the current list of members of the joint liturgical group, there is no Baptist we have failed to appoint. I don't know where that lies in the Baptist Union Council or what subcommittee, but we just haven't bothered these days. Sadly, I am still invited to churches to preach and preside at the table, where afterwards I'm met at the door by people profoundly moved and excited by my conduct of what, in all honesty, I perceive to be no more than a given form of true worship. And who say, we don't generally get that vision energy theology in our communion service. And above all, I'm still struggling in the church I'm a member of now, in preaching Calvin's dictum, infrequent communion is the very work of the devil. That's my little introduction. I don't know my prejudices released for you to enjoy or not.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for giving us the journey that you went on from a teenager into adulthood on how your understanding of the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper moved as well, and so some of the background to where you got to, and some of your reflections also to where you are today. Um, I think for me, just as a way of opening up the conversation, I tried to think back to what I remember of the Lord's Supper as a teenager, in the way that you remembered. And obviously, for me, I was a teenager in the 1990s,
Mm.
and I can't really think of much. Um, I can't remember actually when I started. I'm guessing it was after baptism, so there was still that kind of strong link that participation at the table came
Yeah,
following baptism, which would have been put me about 14. But I can't think of anything significant about how it happened or what and what it was like, which I find a little bit disappointing. And I just think now to my own children and the church I'm in, where they experience communion. So the whole church experiences communion at least once a month. We're all together, and I wonder what that means for them having that experience, happening in different ways each time, compared to what you experienced back in the 60s to what I experienced in the 90s. But I guess, and I guess as you reflected, we've gained a lot. I also wonder if we've lost anything though, by there was something about even when it happened after the service, there was something about the significance of what was going on that you decided that you wanted to stay
yeah.
for it and everything like that. And I wonder now, actually, by putting it into our normal service, whether we've lost something of its specialness. But I don't know. But yeah, what did others make of Keith's lecture and the reflections that he shared? Let's have some conversation together. Sally, go for it.
Yes, I've got tons of questions, but here's my first one. Um, how often would you like to celebrate communion if you had a free magic wand?
Well, when I had a free magic wand, the only time in my life as a Baptist minister, which was in Prague, where there was absolutely nothing, and I decided, I mean, the old Southern Baptist regime, they hardly even gathered for prayer at all. My predecessor couldn't be bothered with that. So I started with a clean page there, and we had it weekly on a Wednesday
Mhm.
in a circle round the table, with different folk preaching and celebrating, which was an eye opener to our Russian and Eastern European friends because I had a woman colleague, Cheryl Brown, who's an Old Testament scholar from the US, and I said Cheryl took a place on the rota, which immediately caused eyes to pop from the Russians and others. But yeah, so that's not. I see all the problems of doing it weekly in a local church setting. It's a special place, isn't it? A college. It gives you opportunities to do many things differently to a gathering church. So we manage twice a month at Shipley, but I think the pattern there is, we try to do it around the meal table, in different ways, so that it never becomes sterile. I think that's my anxiety. Yeah.
Mm, mm,
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm thinking of a church that I knew of who a new minister came who was keen to celebrate the supper more often and introduce that, but it wasn't without its problems. And when he left, they very quickly reverted
Yeah.
to monthly, which is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I understand that.
I think there's a kind of my worry if so we do it twice a month. I do it once with the whole church, and I do it once with the children out of their rock group. So there's a different feel to those two times. I wonder if we went to weekly, which I'm not against, but my fear is it would feel like it would be something that was being tagged on, rather than something significant.
Yeah.
I just think that's the way that because of
Yeah.
the focus on the word, and so I guess when I'm in those two times, I'm trying to give it its significance.
Yeah.
And you know, so actually when we do it all age, I tend to do communion at the beginning of the service. So rather than trying to drag the children back in, we start round the table, then we move to the word. And I don't know whether that's theologically correct or not, but it just I find it actually quite an interesting way of help. And that for me, that's one of the great things about being Baptist. We're free to think about the ordering of things. But yeah, that's my worry about going weekly, is it would be something that we tagged on very quickly at the end rather than being something that was significant.
Yeah.
Whereas our Anglican brothers are just shaped by that, by a particular order, which I think hopefully doesn't, I don't know, I don't regularly work in an Anglican church. It doesn't feel like that. Yeah. Stephen, did you want to come in?
Well, yes, but in a different angle, really. Reflecting back, even, I mean, the church that I was part of, but many years before that, as with many churches, would have you would hand in either a card or something to say that you had been at communion, and that if you missed two, you'd get a visit from the deacons.
Yeah.
Now, on a negative side, one could see that is a measure of control, and making sure. On the positive side, and I think it's reflecting something what Keith is trying to say, it would ensure as much as possible that as many people were there for that particular service, or two. I mean, where I was, we had one in the morning, one in the evening, and then a communion in the afternoon, each month. Poor minister, really. You just wonder how much, with a much more erratic peer approach to membership or approach to participate, not erratic, that's not the right word, a less frequent peer. If you miss your once a month, but it is the fellowship meal, you've missed it for 2 months. And I just wonder, I was minded of something, and you will pick this up, weren't you, Keith, that Michael Walker was saying that in a sense, the Baptists had a record that didn't move. They went to this sort of mere memorialism as a reaction against the Anglo-Catholics in the 1830s, and got kind of stuck in the groove. And you wonder, to some extent, when we begin to talk about new ways of doing church, new ways of being church, accepting people, whether the theology keeps up with the practice or vice versa. What does communion mean for someone who doesn't have the architecture in which to put it together?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I'm always struck by the churches in the Huddersfield area, which go back to their roots to the great Salandine Nook Church, which never loses members. You know, even if you're in the graveyard, you're still on their membership roll. And Salandine Nook, at a critical point in their story, had a minister who had the privilege of going to a Scottish university and had picked up the Church of Scotland's, John Knox and his 3 months, and the communion season, the preparation, which I'd learned about at my granny's knee, coming from the north of Scotland. She even had clothes that were only worn on communion Sunday. So there's this high John Knox view, and it's still around there in corners of Huddersfield, where you've got to work up to it. My brother-in-law, when he was church secretary for one of the churches in Yorkshire, still had to keep the record, ticking people off, whether they'd been sufficient Sundays before communion. So that is there too. But my experience of being involved on the side of a church plant we attempted in Bradford was that they actually built it as a midweek service around a meal, and prayers were said around the meal, and the meal was a proper meal. They restored all the actions of the Eucharist in that way, and that seemed to appeal to people from outside the church. The whole sense of eating together, which appears to be what the New Testament was on about. So there's two big contrasts there.
See, again, that's fascinating. So it was taken so seriously that you had to come a particular number of Sundays before you could, And again, we've lost all that.
Yeah.
So I remember musing with another Baptist minister that in both our churches, if we stopped doing communion, how long would it be before our church noticed?
Yeah.
How many months could go by? And there's that, that's picking up what you said, Stephen, that sense of actually when you had a ticket and when it happened to the thing, it was, you needed to be there. That was part of your membership. It was part of your discipleship. And now it's a kind of, well, if I'm there, it's lovely. If I missed it, whereas, and I think that's, for me, that's one of our problems as Baptists again, that I'm not sure we've ever taken the table. Well, I don't know if that's true of the 17th century and beyond, but I wonder, at least in the 20th century or the late 20th century, we've always taken the table seriously enough. Which is why I think your lecture, turning up when it did, Keith, was important. Yeah. Edward, have you got anything before Sally might come back in again?
I thought you were going to ask, have you got anything profound to say? Well, unlikely. I did. I mean, it's the first time I've come across your lecture, Keith, and I really enjoyed it. I'm not massively familiar with Zwingli at all, so it's really interesting to read. I mean, just a bit of a side comment. Page 28, I love you were talking about 27 and 28, you were talking about the different ways in which communion had been enacted, the drama of communion. And right at the top of page 28, for the manufacturers and entrepreneurs engaged in chapel expansion in the 1800s, it was the worship of the organ. Just ... Yeah. And I just had a chuckle to myself with this idea of the worship of the organ.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is so familiar. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think one of the points you touched upon, whether it was a closed meal or an open meal and who was involved and so on. And my own practice is, I think, one that I very much moved to, is that of an open invitation that whoever is present, you are invited to share, whether you're, old and kind of in your spiritual journey, or whether you're young, or whether you're not really sure, you've come with questions, or or whatever. But the idea of it being an invitation, yeah, absolutely. But I think overall, Keith, it just, yeah, I mean, some of the comments that have already been made about, if we didn't do communion, would it be missed? And yet, I know that when we've done communion as part of a meal, it's really been appreciated.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I wrote liturgy for the Northumbria community at one point, and I think that it's still in use by them, of Eucharist or communion around the meal table with everyone involved, everybody thanking God, and all this kind of thing. Very much a Thanksgiving meal, and I think that's a very rich way of doing it. And of course, next week with Maundy Thursday, I hinted that we would do it in our new cafe area, and I'm thinking, having read your lecture today, I think, yeah, maybe we should go for that and make it more of a thing.
Yeah, I think strongly that way. I mean, again, when we were in Prague, we were dissatisfied, not only us, but quite a lot of people, with the existing international churches. So we thought, okay, let's start our own, And it joined the Czech Baptist Union and the various, but in that church, the standard form of communion became for bringing food to a meal. And as as I suppose the introduction to the Thanksgiving, we would go round the table and there would be 35, 40 of us perhaps. So it didn't take that long. And there was a strict instruction. You can only say, I thank God for. And we'd mention somebody who'd been important to us in our own spiritual pilgrimage. And that became very moving. People thought really hard about that. Who had helped them on the journey? It was a sort of thinking of another discussion that goes on amongst us. Is there a sort of Baptist list of saints? Well, we got some very odd bods and sisters and so on from all across Europe mentioned there. But people became involved in the Thanksgiving prayer. And I found that I've tried it once or twice at Shipley when I've been presiding, but somehow in a congregation scattered across comfy chairs and so on, it doesn't work quite the same. But there, it was quite a profound experience. Everybody became engaged in the Thanksgiving, which was about the people who'd helped us, and then, of course, culminating in the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. Mm. I tried that at the once to persuade other folk in Europe to think more about that. There's an article by me in this book, Anabaptism and Mission, about the Eucharistic prayer and how we might have a sort of Anabaptist Eucharistic prayer. And I set out a text there, which I happen to know is used in a couple of churches in Canada and 2 or 3 in Ukraine and so on, because you feel you want to engage in the dynamics of it in a very different way. We don't need the formalized, very carefully defined theology of our Catholic and Anglican friends, but we do need somehow to incorporate the main themes about why on earth we do it after all this time. And I think we can have a very Anabaptist way of doing that.
Could you say more, Keith, about Hubmaier?
Yeah, well, it was a classic.
Or particularly his perspective on.
Yeah, well, he jumped around at first. He was Zwingli's right-hand man, and then he rejected Zwingli, and then he was reconciled to Zwingli, and then he had to run away to Moravia. But in Moravia, he's set up in Mikolov, and this is where most of his writing comes from. So he's not a systematic theologian, but he has a lot of pieces he wrote which concentrate on this idea of the gathering church he created there. He baptized 3,000 folk in about 18 months. So he was no laggard at drawing people to their own faith. But where he saw the focus, where's the real presence of Christ? And he said it's in these people who've committed themselves. So he moved away from Luther and away from Zwingli's transsignification, about the elements, to the people. And I've found that fascinating, that as you call down the Holy Spirit upon these people, that here is the sign of the risen Christ. There are several books these days about Hubmaier, and several theological books that explain that. And I can do you a little list and email you if you want, Edward. But yeah, again, he's exactly like Zwingli, of course, because before he'd finished what he was up to, Archduke Ferdinand had him dragged off to Linz and burnt at the stake, so he never got a chance to turn all these thoughts into a systematic theology. He'd nobody to protect him. But he raises, for me, very interesting thoughts which you can work with as you move forward, and very true to our concept of what the church is.
So are we saying that Eucharist in this sense works better with small groups. I've always been, oh goodness me, see, I've always been, and I shouldn't ask Peter Morden really, how did Spurgeon do communion at the Metropolitan Tabernacle?
Yeah, sorry.
Is there a different dynamic if you have a church of 600, 700, as you may well have been doing when you were growing up in church? To want to say 20 or 30 people, you can do things much more creatively and flexibly.
Yeah, I mean, in looking at his writings and people have written about him, I wonder if his real Eucharistic experience was at Mentone in the south of France, where he had that sort of ecumenical gathering in where he lived, and they did communion, because you don't get much of a sense of what on earth happened at the Metropolitan Tabernacle, where the table was so small and the pulpit was so large. But at Mentone, you get this image of people gathering in his home, and that's where most of his deeper Eucharistic activity went on.
It's interesting that you mentioned about size. I was a member at Sutton Coldfield Baptist Church when the membership was 600 plus 650, close to 700 or something. And of course, the church had gone through quite a very significant charismatic renewal and so on. And when we had communion, I mean, communion was a massive highlight of worship. And what would happen, as I recall, was bread would be served to you where you were in the rows. But when we had the cup, there were 12 cups, just because of the number of people. And those who were serving would stand at the front of the church, just across the church. The stewards would then indicate when your row was to go forward. And families, even though families may have been split up in the church, you know, the kids were with the young people over there and mum and dad were here, they would come back together at the front to receive the wine together as a family. And there would always be the offer of a blessing or a prayer at the front, or an anointing or whatever. And so communion took absolutely forever to go through, but it was a most moving and wonderful experience. And it only happened like that on a Sunday evening. I think it was morning, evening. That was the routine, but on a Sunday evening. But the musicians would always receive first, and then they would play. Just play gently. Yeah. And it was a.
They were still worshipping the organ.
Still worshipping the organ. No, there was no organ. But I say that. I mean, some beautiful pieces of music were played during communion. But yeah, it was a very moving time, and I saw people being physically healed, dramatically healed at communion, and some quite extraordinary things happened.
That makes me think that we're desperate for some qualitative research into how churches celebrate communion.
I don't know what Sutton Coldfield do now.
No. But yes, well, I think, and that for me, one of my favourite bits of the lecture, Keith, is actually you telling the story of your experiences, and I think it'd be fascinating to tell more of those kind of stories, but also look at how is communion being celebrated today. And I think we'd get that much, obviously, amongst us as Baptists, there'd be this rich variety compared to, our Anglican and Catholic friends. Sally, did you want to come back in?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just think this is so amazing, so interesting. And one of the things I love the idea of recovering the drama and sort of actually living that experience of being around the table with Jesus, but actually trying to sort of make that well, not make that real, but you know what I mean, sort of inhabit that story. And I was thinking, we've really retained the drama of baptism in the Baptist church, but we've lost the drama of the table, haven't we? And I'm just interested in the way those two things have gone. But we had a conversation on Zoom last week on, the module that you've been helping us with, Keith. So we're almost at the end now, but we did a discussion on baptism and communion last week, and we had we got 9 people on this call. Most of them are Baptists. They're either ministers in training, interested Baptists. We had one who was a Baptist for 30 years and he's now a Quaker. And then there was one person who's an Anglican clergyman, but he's pastor of an LEP with a Baptist component. So he was there just because he really wanted to inform himself, and he's been a great dialogue partner. And this discussion of how people did communion, so some of them are in church plants, and there was this huge variety, as you've just said. And some people were saying, oh, we just get the children to take bread and wine round. And others were saying, oh, yes, well, we just have a meal and then we kind of include it. And the Anglican person was quite disturbed by this. I think he was quite disturbed by the variety of practice, by the people who could handle their elements. And he just said, it's so interesting, but I'm prickling because good order is so important to us. But actually in your lecture, Keith, you do talk about good order, don't you? And about who should handle the elements. And I wonder if, I'm sorry, that was a bit of a long preamble, but I wonder if you've got any thoughts on whether you've changed your mind on that.
Well, yeah, I think in all these things, I think somehow the responsibility for determining the parameters of who should do things rests with the church meeting. I don't think it belongs to a particular office or whatever. I think the church meeting can set aside. I think, that was all blown up for me when I went to visit the Church of the Lamb of God, which lives on a rubbish tip in San Salvador, El Salvador. And they had a liturgy where they had, I give it that name, they wouldn't have recognised that as that, but they gathered early on a Sunday morning for breakfast, and the breakfast concluded with the elements. And she's died now, but there was an absolutely fantastic older lady in the church, Lucy, who I wrote about her once in the BMS magazine, who was a street sweet seller and actually had a ministry to prostitutes. She really would get alongside them. And some of these prostitutes came to the church, and the church thought, how do we incorporate these folk who, by many standards of Baptists across the world, were outsiders? How do we bring them in? And so it was the church meeting decided it was their office to distribute the bread. And I sat there thinking, how would that go down in any English Baptist churches at the time? But it was very profound. Yeah. These were women way beyond the pale, if we can say that, who the church was working out how to bring in the inclusivity of the community of God. And I think, I'm no New Testament scholar, but to me, Jesus was about bringing people into the circle, not excluding people. And I sat and took my bread from this woman who previously serviced several of the military outside the barracks in the middle of San Salvador. And I think that was a profoundly moving moment in my own spiritual journey. So my argument is the community of the church determines these things, not some specific office.
I agree with that, and I'm not sure that in some of the examples that were discussed on that evening that was the case. I think it felt more haphazard than that. And so I that's a really interesting nuance, isn't it?
It is.
Something that,
yeah. I mean, I first had to encounter it, and I never. When Ernie Payne was president of the union, the church I was ministering at then, Balnoldsbury, said we're going to invite Ernie Payne because it was a special anniversary year for us. And he came, and we got communion on the Sunday morning in the new building we then got. And we put Ernie Payne in those days down to do everything except, And in the vestry, he said to me, Keith, I will not preside at the Lord's table. You must do that. You're the appointed pastor. And I'd never thought of that. I mean, he wasn't, but he was so strict about that. So I kind of thinking, well, what do I actually think about that since then? And I think I've come to the Church of the Lamb of God position, that the church meeting, the community, the gathering community of believers decides who does what, not by office, not by. But I mean, I'm all in favour of it being done competently and well. Course.
So I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because the Payne and Winwood book was called Orders and Prayers.
Yes.
The 91 book was called Patterns and Prayers.
Yes.
And in one sense, I guess Gathering for Worship is the same.
Yeah.
It's wanting to bring some normativity to the way that we celebrate the Lord's Supper or communion. So actually, that it's recognizable across Baptist churches that we're doing the same thing. And again, that comes back again to that this is a serious thing. And I think for me, that's the tension. I want people to come, but I also want to make this not just an everyday, ordinary. It's that's the balance and that thoughtfulness around it. So I guess the last thought would be it's actually the formation of ministers and how to lead communion well. I think is so key. And just having experience sometimes of people having no idea really what they're doing about the fourfold, for me, that's got to be some recognizable for me. The fourfold has got to be there in some way. Not really knowing what a Thanksgiving prayer is. I think it's worrying because I think, you draw out, we live in an ecumenical age. And so I think for me that our ecumenical sisters and brothers might recognize what we're doing, or even if we're doing it slightly differently.
Yeah. The husband of one of our deacons is a lifelong dyed in the blood Catholic. And he will come to communion at Shipley, which he didn't used to do, apparently. If I'm being scheduled to preside at the table, he said, I can recognize, Keith, though you don't use the words I use, I can recognize in what you're doing, the shape. And, I think, I'm still stuck with that. However, whether you're doing it around the meal table in the hall below, or whether you've got all the kids there, there's balloons and streamers and everything, there is a shape to it, I think, which the church has attested to over the centuries, and you've got to somehow see how you work that out. It's not about the exact words or the exact actions, but it is about, as you say, the fourfold, or indeed, if you put the meal back in and everything else, the sevenfold actions of the meal.
Just a quick comment on, just picking you up, Andy, on ministerial formation. I think it was you made the comment. And just, I've expressed before to various people, the limited amount of time that ministerial students now spend in their colleges. And, I won't say who, but one of the college principals commented to me a few years ago that it was impossible to do theology properly with student ministers just because they weren't in college long enough, and there wasn't the opportunity for much hangout time, conversation, and all these kind of things. And much as I would like the Baptist Church, the Baptist family, to have a richer theology of communion, I express concern, really, because I don't think the ministerial formation is given the time and space. But I mean, I'll say that to you, Andy, as somebody involved in colleges, or Sally. I don't know what you see.
I think there are some real challenges, which I don't know if we've got it completely right, would be my sense. And we need to think differently about how we do formation. So, I've commented recently that formation is not a 3-year thing at college. It's a 6-year thing, putting the NAMs in, and we need to make the NAM experience a lot more content filled. And I think even then we need to do things around what formation means, and it's not just, and communion is a big part of that. Leading communion well can make a huge difference in our congregations. Leading it badly gets to the point where actually it becomes this meaningless thing, where actually we don't miss it, and so actually putting the time in to think about what we're doing at the table. I think that for me is one of the big challenges. What do we think we're doing when we receive the bread and wine? And I think why we latch onto the memorialist, or many of our church members latch onto the memorialist, because we kind of understand what we're doing there. We're thinking about Jesus dying for us. But actually, we want to say a lot more is going on at the table, but actually helping people to articulate that in the words and the drama of the way that we do it is so important and key. Yeah. Sally, I don't know if you've got a comment as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that the time thing in and of itself is a problem, Ed. I mean, yes, we don't have the time in college that we used to, but students do things differently. Different doesn't necessarily mean worse, but I think it's important that what time we do have, we use it well, and that I think we need to. I mean, I think my sense is that we need to embed a sense that we are forever in formation, that it continues, even beyond NAMS, that we continue to be formed in, and that there is something about formation that I think is about the ultimate formation of the person. And I like Paul Goodliff's thing about it being exemplary disciples, in the sense that this isn't about being holier or reading your Bible more. It's actually about coming quickly back to the foot of the cross when you know that you need to. It's about your discipleship, and it seems to me there's something about that. But I think the way we teach theology has changed. I think some people end up doing lots of theology and some people can get away with doing relatively little. And I'm not sure quite what we can do about that, because students are purchasers of their education now. There's been a huge change. It's so different from, even when we were at college. The whole dynamic is different. I think something else I'd say is that I think I'm quite persuaded by the view of Banks that students learn more from the culture in which they are being educated than the things that they're actually taught. And I do think that there's some truth in that. That's not to say you can vacate the curriculum of any content, but I think that if it's theological through and through, then people will pick theology up in a variety of ways. So I think there are new ways of doing things, and maybe we just haven't quite got there yet, because the change has been quite quick. I think that would be my view on it.
James, I don't know if you've got anything that you want to offer in, which may be part of the conversation or take us in a different direction. I know that part of your doctoral studies has been thinking about the Eucharist in terms of Paul Fidders and William Kavanagh.
So firstly, sorry it's so late, everyone. Various things going on, and didn't manage to make it. And I'm really sorry, because it sounds like I came in at a really interesting part of the conversation. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about recently, so I'm comparing Baptist and Catholic practices of the Eucharist, and particularly focusing at the moment on the formational potential. And that does require, I think, as some of you have been saying, paying a lot of attention to what it is we think is going on here, but also the ways in which every part of what we do actually is formative and makes a difference. So the actions, what we expect people to do, whether they're standing or sitting or kneeling, actually makes a difference to the sort of people that then get sent away from the table out into the world. So I'm really interested in that at the moment, using some of the work by James Smith and others to explore that a bit. But I agree, echoing that conversation about children and who gets to serve and all that. I think there is space for all of that in Baptist churches, but again, as you were saying, Keith, I think we just need to think about it and have decided why we're doing it like that, and understand the implications of our decisions. Rather than just, I think too often we just treat it as a practical exercise. How can we include people, or how can we get this done quickly, over and done with, so we can go back to proper worship or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, and that's perhaps one of the biggest struggles, getting a congregation to really reflect on that and discern together what is it that we're doing, and how are we truly satisfied by it, not satisfied for ourselves, but satisfied that what we're doing is appropriate, a real offering to God, and a proper response to the biblical witness. Yeah.
But I think that there is, I guess it's more personal experience than anything concrete, but my sense is that people in churches are keen for a deeper understanding, because it so often is completely unsatisfying, the whole experience. And people, we do it because we feel like we should, and because Jesus said we should, and it's just the thing that we've always done. But I think a lot of people in our churches have no idea really what's meant to be happening here, and what am I meant to be thinking, what am I meant to be feeling, and how do I engage with this? And so I think that there is a thirst for a deeper theological engagement by our churches, if we as ministers and theologians can lead them in that.
Yeah.
In Andy's putative research project, perhaps one of the opening questions could be, do you consider what you to do to be an ordinance or a sacrament?
Yes, yeah, and I think that still is perhaps going on, and I'd hope people might say both. Yeah, I think, again, what's helpful, Keith, about your lecture and into its second half is you begin to try and talk about the things that we do and why we might do them. For me also, there's Steve Finnemore's chapter in the Fresh Shift Paul Fides does that really helpfully, again, I think in another way. He talks about why the deacons are served first, and then and then serve everybody else. He talks about why it's important that there's bread left over at the end, because it communicates God's abundant love. There's always enough, and and I think those kind of things actually talk about why we do what we do. Are some of those things which our churches can grasp and hold on to. This mystery.
Our church, we have a beautiful homemade loaf, and there's always some left over, but we've got into the Orthodox way of talking about that as the arrabon, the foretaste, and because our children are only sometimes present, they all then come back for that, to have their bit of the arrabon, the foretaste of the glorious things of the kingdom, and they've caught on to that. I mean, the bread tastes very nice, of course, that's an additional incentive, but we've tried to talk to them that this is something which in its fullness you can receive. It's not, I mean, occasionally we do have everybody there for communion, but on those occasions when we don't, we've tried to engage the children of the church in that, in understanding that in the way the Orthodox Church does. Yeah.
Because there's something for me, so the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, got a new liturgy. And so everybody in the local Catholic church, I'm guessing this is true everywhere, had to go to classes to learn the new liturgy,
right,
to learn the new responses, to learn, and this what a massive formative thing. Now, we can say there's some negative things about that as well, but there's something about actually, this is serious. We need to know what we're doing and when we're doing it and why, which again, I guess our practice is very much, hopefully people just pick it up as they go along. Again, I think that for me, I haven't got the answer to this, but how we welcome children into what's going on at the table and how we welcome new Christians into what's going on at the table. Do we prepare them for something, or is it just they participate?
Yeah.
Should we prepare them? And in one sense, that probably means we need to prepare the whole church, because none of the church probably really know what's going on when we gather around the back. Yeah, it's
Paul Sheppey, in the churches he was minister of, used to have bread and honey for the children, and talk in talking to the kids about, you know, that as a significance, a sign on the journey of where you're moving towards. And the kids, well, they're now adults at Barlick, where he did that, still remember that as, you know, there are whole different things you can bring in, signs and symbols, aren't there, that help you tell the story and prepare people in different ways.
Which is the other tension for me. So, you know, for a long time, you participate at the table following baptism. But we've talked about in our conversation, actually, that we've broken that practice in lots of our ways, and anyone is welcome to the table. And you might come to the table and then come to faith and then come to baptism. Where is the place of baptism in relation to communion now? I think for me is again, you know, I've broken that practice in my own congregation, but I'm left with thinking, you know, why bother getting baptized if I can participate at the table and, you know, receive the, you know, the grace there. And so I think there are questions that it then raises for us when we start to be playing with the tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very true. But I think, again, as you were saying, we ought to be having that sort of discussion in the community of the church, rather than just slipping into a practice which opens that up. I mean, as I'm claiming the lecture, I grew up in a church which firmly fenced the table. So I knew all about that. I never had communion until the day I was baptized. And I see the strengths of that.
Yeah.
But equally, living in an inclusive church now, which, you know, we've got refugees from different parts of the world and all the rest of it. And, you know, the inclusivity has another message that it brings, doesn't it? But it does point up that challenge about baptism.
Mm-hmm.
One church I went to, I was explaining in communion way, the elements were covered, and because that was the practice of the church, and she said, "Oh, I thought that was so the flies didn't get on it."
With that comment, have we got any other final comments so that doesn't become the last comment as we bring our time to an end?
I'd just say thank you for the opportunity to take the lecture down off the shelf and reread it again for myself and think about, you know, the journey from when I first wrote it. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm very grateful for that, and this conversation, which will give me other things to think about in the days to come.
Well, let us say thank you, Keith, for originally writing the lecture all those years ago and for joining us to reflect on it again. I think we're finding that each lecture that we're revisiting, it's a worthwhile exercise to revisit, because there's lots for us to remember if we're rereading it, or to read for the first time. That I think is helpful again for us being Baptists, and that's been true of rereading this lecture or reading it for the first time, and the conversation that we've had. I think we've probably come to the end of our conversation with more thinking and conversation probably to take place, but that's no bad thing than coming up with any firm answers. But I do believe Baptists need to spend more time thinking about the table and what we're doing there and what it might mean. And Keith, your lectures are really helpful in helping us do that. So thank you, everyone.